The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
Oh, may God have mercy on your souls.
Searching for new evidence.
If I was carrying out a case like hers today, I would just simply call it drowning.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? On a summer's night in 1839, a couple who operated a canal lock in rural Staffordshire were awoken by a woman's piercing screams. Outside, a group of drunken boatmen terrorised their sole passenger, 37-year-old Christina Collins. The ex-magician's assistant was attempting to reach London for a new life with her recently married husband, but there proved to be no escape from this boat. At dawn the following morning, Christina's lifeless body was pulled from the water 6 miles downstream. Suspicion fell heavily on one of the narrowboat crew in particular, 27-year-old George Thomas. Despite professing his innocence, Thomas was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. On the 11th of April 1840, outside Stafford Prison, in front of 10,000 spectators, he was publicly hanged in a twin execution alongside the boat's skipper. Now, 180 years on, George Thomas's relative Jeanette is desperate for justice.
This is where I start with my family tree. It was my father who started the ball rolling with this case by telling me when I was about 8 or 9 that we'd got a murderer in the family. And then this line here goes up to William Thomas, who is George Thomas's brother. I feel sorry that Christina Collins was murdered and there is a victim in this terrible crime. I'm not saying that the men were angels, but I think George Thomas was used as a scapegoat, but I don't think he did murder her. If my dad was still alive now, he'd be sitting here by the side of me, proud that we could finally try and clear George Thomas's name and get a good reputation back for him. Because my dad always told me about George, I'm doing it for him mainly, and for my mum, who started me on this amazing family journey.
George Thomas's trial was contentious, turning on the testimony of a dubious key witness. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern legal team cast the conviction in a different light? Defence barrister Jeremy Dean QC has defended high-profile clients for over 3 decades. For the prosecution is Sasha Wass QC, who's represented the Crown in some of the UK's most famous criminal cases. Jeanette has travelled to London to meet the barristers to try and find out the truth.
Hello, Jeanette.
Hello.
Jeremy, nice to meet you.
And you?
Jeanette, hello.
Hello.
Sasha, hi.
Well, thanks for coming. Do you feel you know enough about the case to have a belief that George Thomas was wrongly hanged for murder?
Although he was a bit of a naughty lad, I don't believe that he did the murder now.
Why not?
The captain had a little bit more to do with it than what was believed.
As far as our investigations are concerned, it might be the situation that we find something that is very damaging to George Thomas, which in fact, rather than exonerates him, concludes that he must have been guilty of this murder. Now, were that to happen, how would you be able to deal with it?
It would be nice to try and get his name cleared as an unsafe verdict, but if you find evidence that he did commit it, well then it's one of the things that we have to put up with.
OK. I prosecute and defend, but for the purpose of this case, I'm going to be looking at the evidence from the prosecution perspective.
Right.
But if I were to find something which causes me to conclude that the verdicts in the case may well be unsafe, I will not hesitate to tell the judge that.
We'll keep you updated.
Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed for coming.
It's a pleasure.
It's been really nice meeting you.
And you,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
George Thomas was born in Staffordshire in 1812 into a farming family and grew up in the civil parish of Wombourne. As a teenager, Thomas found work on commercial narrowboats that ran freight up and down the industrial artery of early Victorian England, the Trent and Mersey Canal. At age 27, he took up with a new crew on a Pickford's flyboat that operated round-the-clock intercity canal haulage. On the boat was a boy called William Musson, veteran captain James Owen, and 28-year-old boatman William Ellis. Thomas had only been employed on this flyboat for less than a fortnight when Christina Collins died. But could this young, hard-working man really have been responsible for her death?
There were a number of witnesses who saw what is said to have occurred. They paint a picture of a drunken group of men sexually abusing and intimidating Christina. They claimed that she'd been suicidal and had fallen into the water. In fact, there were two trials. The first trial was for serious sexual assault. The judge, in fact, found that there was insufficient evidence and acquitted the defendants. There followed a trial for murder, and another witness gave evidence for the prosecution, and Owen, Ellis, and George Thomas were found guilty of murder. So, what do you think about this case, Sasha?
What I'd like to do is find out why there were two trials, and I'd like to look into the criminal procedure that existed in those days, because we're going back to 1839.
Christina was born in 1801 in Nottingham. She worked as a magician's assistant to her first husband, but was widowed young and had no children. Christina remarried a stableman, Robert Collins, and was on her way to start a new life with him in London before she met her tragic death. But was George Thomas more of a culprit than any of the other boatmen? Jeanette wants to understand the event that altered the course of her family history 180 years ago. She's come to the scene of the crime and is meeting her cousin Patricia, also a descendant of George Thomas.
It feels quite eerie being
Yes.
stood here where it actually happened, the place where she met her death.
Quite secluded.
It's a quiet spot.
On Saturday, the 15th of June, 1839, Christina made her way from Liverpool to Preston Brook. The boat left at 7 p.m. from that way.
Christina was the only passenger on board. The crew drank heavily from whiskey they were transporting. At midnight on the 16th of July, the boat reached the final lock Christina was witnessed at.
The last time she was officially heard was when she screamed at Who Mill Lock.
That the witnesses, who would have been Mr. and Mrs. Mills in that house, heard a woman scream, "Don't tempt me, I'll not go down."
As the boatman became increasingly abusive towards Christina, she got on and off the boat several times. At around 3 a.m, things took a fatal turn.
So this looks like the Brinkley's bank.
She was out walking along this towpath when she was actually pushed into the canal or fell off the boat. So this is where she actually met her death here.
Christina's body was found by a passing canal worker just after dawn.
So it's quite difficult being here because, unfortunately, although it was the end of her life, it was the beginning of an untimely chapter for George Thomas that started the pathway to his untimely death. Quite sad.
Christina's body was carried up a passageway that's become etched into local folklore in the town of Rugeley.
So, Pat, why are these called the Bloody Steps?
The original ones were said to have been stained with Christina's blood as they dragged her up the steps. These steps have been a legend for 180 years now. It must have been quite horrendous how they roughly dragged her out of the water and just dragged her up to the top of those steps.
Yes.
There again, this place is eerie too.
I think, to me, this seems quite haunting.
This is very much part of our family history.
Definitely the main part.
The men reported their passenger missing at the next lock. By this time, however, a manhunt was already in full swing. The crew were quickly arrested and faced a coroner's inquest that very day in a local inn, before they'd even had time to sober up. No fewer than 24 witnesses gave testimony against them. Sasha and Jeremy are examining their accounts.
Now, Christina Collins, at 7 o'clock on Saturday the 15th of June, boarded the Pickford Company boat at Preston Brook. Here. She was travelling south on the Trent and Mersey Canal. The following day, at 8 o'clock that evening, the boat had reached Stone, and Hugh Cornwall, who was a check clerk, heard Christina complaining that she feared that the men she was with were going to meddle with her. That's the expression that she used. A little south of Stone, a witness called John Tansley saw Christina walking on the edge of the canal on the path, and his wife, Catherine Tansley, heard Thomas say that he would not work on the boat any longer if she stayed in the cabin. So there was clearly some discord at that stage between Thomas and Christina Collins.
Although Christina Collins was still on and off the boat.
She was still associating with the people,
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. By midnight, the boat had reached Who Mill Lock. And two witnesses, Anne and James Mills, who lived in the lock house, were awakened by female screaming. And they were obviously concerned, and they asked one of the men on the boat, they're not sure which man it was, whether the woman was with anyone. And that man replied that she was with her husband, which of course was not true. So at 5 a.m, Christina's body is retrieved from the canal at Brindley Bank.
Christina Collins remained in and around the boat for the whole time. She could have distanced herself. She could have left. She could have complained in clear terms as to what she felt might happen to her or what was happening to her, but she didn't. Principally, however, bearing in mind that George Thomas was found guilty of murder, and indeed others were too, nothing you've said directly implicates George Thomas in the murder of Christina Collins.
We can be sure of some things, can't we? She was clearly very unhappy during parts of the journey. Now, it's perhaps a little unkind of you to suggest that she should simply go away and leave. She was a woman of limited means who was trying to travel the cheapest possible way to get to see her husband in London. And she really didn't have the independence or the means to simply take off and take another form of transport.
No, but she could have asked for help in clear terms.
She was complaining to other people that she feared these men were going to meddle with her. Now, I'm presuming that's a euphemism for something more sinister. She is clearly upset. She is screaming to the extent that people on the lock actually make inquiries as to whether she's with other people. So this was not a happy journey, and the result was that she was drowned, and as soon as her disappearance was noticed, they start suggesting that she had drowned herself.
Well, Sasha, all I would say is this, that there is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
At the 4-day inquest, Captain Owen claimed Thomas had sexually abused Christina Collins, aided and abetted by Ellis, and that afterwards, she'd taken her own life. While Thomas claimed the captain was her attacker. All of the boatmen were charged with murder. Additional charges of rape, common assault and theft were also laid. But what really happened that night aboard the narrowboat? Jeanette and Patricia have come to the Black Country Living Museum. They're meeting canal expert Wendy Freer, who's researched the case thoroughly.
What type of situation would it have been for a lady to have come onto this scene?
All boatmen were said to drink heavily, swear a lot, get into fights. Their reputation was just dreadful. The fact that these boatmen had been drinking heavily throughout the voyage was nothing unusual. And poor Christina would never have consented to go on that long journey by herself with these men unless there was no alternative. She just didn't have the money to get there any other way.
Wendy, what do you think about George Thomas and his part in this?
What we do know about George Thomas is that he took against Christina pretty much from the start. He objected to her coming into the boatman's cabin. He thought she should be in her own place in the passenger space. He also had a big row with the captain over this and threatened to leave.
He kept changing his story as well, didn't he, the captain, with the boy, whereas George Thomas and William Ellis...
They were consistent.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the other important thing is, when did George Thomas realise that she was missing? Because it seems to have happened between Colwich Lock and Brindley's Bank. Now, that was the stretch where Thomas and Ellis were asleep and Owen was steering. So at what point did Owen alert Thomas to the fact that the passenger was missing? Because it was the two of them who went back to look for her.
I thought it looked like the captain knew that she had drowned and was saying to George Thomas, let's go and look for her to cover for himself.
It does look as if Owen was the one who knew what happened. Musson, the boy, was driving the horse. Now, it seems that the other two were still asleep at that point.
As suspicion gathered around Captain Owen, the first trial against the boatman commenced in July 1839. Charges against the boy Musson were dropped, and the judge directed the jury to find the boatman not guilty of rape due to lack of evidence. But astonishingly, before the murder charge could be considered, the prosecution produced a key witness, a convicted cellmate of Captain Owen, called Joseph Orgill. The murder trial was postponed until this prisoner could testify at a second trial. That could only happen after he'd been pardoned, a bonus which at the time, Orgill claimed he knew nothing about. Sasha and Jeremy want an insight into why this occurred. They're meeting legal historian Dr. Philip Handler.
Now, Mr. Orgill was convicted of bigamy and was serving a sentence of imprisonment when he came to share a cell with Owen, the captain of the boat. And Orgill gave evidence of what Owen had told him. So we're talking about multiple hearsay now. And what Owen was said to have said was this: the other two men, that's Ellis and Thomas, committed the rape upon her and mauled her to death. Our opinion, by the modern-day rules of hearsay, is that this would not have been admissible before a jury.
Well, there was a rule against hearsay, but there were exceptions to that rule, one of which involved confessions. And another significant difference between then and now is that the trial judge had much more discretion to admit such evidence, but then advise the jury as to how much weight they should attach to it.
But this was not a confession by Owen. He was effectively blaming Thomas and Ellis.
And the evidence was coming from a convicted criminal.
So a tainted
Yes.
source.
Yes. Orgill maintained, I think, in the second trial that he knew nothing of the pardon until the actual date of the trial. In a letter which I have here, the prison governor had said to Orgill that a pardon could be the outcome.
So Orgill must have lied when he told the jury that he had no idea that a pardon would ensue.
Yes, he must have lied. A number of people wrote into the Home Office to discredit the character of Joseph Orgill. So we have one here from a number of inhabitants of Burton-upon-Trent, which is where Orgill was from, indicating that he was indeed a completely disreputable character whose evidence shouldn't be given any weight at all.
And more significant than the fact that he lied, that there is evidence that he did in fact have an incentive to lie at the trial about his knowledge of what took place.
Yes, that's significant. In 1839, there was no appeal court, no mechanism for quashing a conviction. The only practical remedy for someone convicted at this time was to petition the Crown for a pardon.
Orgill was a mouthpiece for Owen. I don't know whether Owen told Orgill what Orgill told the jury, or whether Orgill just made it up because he's friends with Owen. What we do know is that Orgill gave evidence in highly questionable circumstances, and that's a matter of very serious concern.
This alarming U-turn, triggered by Joseph Orgill, meant the boatmen, including George Thomas, waited in jail for a further 8 months before their murder trial. Jeanette and Patricia want to understand more about the impact this surprise witness had.
This is the Staffordshire Gazette. It says here, considerable conversation took place between his lordship, which would be the judge of the case, and the learned counsel for the prosecution and the defence, respecting the postponement of the trial charge of murder until March Assizes. Well, why would they do that? And then it says the material evidence alluded to in the affidavit is Joseph Orgill, who has been tried, convicted and sentenced to be imprisoned for 18 months for the crime of bigamy.
Well, how
Where's
could they
he
trust
come
him?
from? Well, who is he? He hasn't been mentioned at all in any of the rape case.
And
well, if he's done for
bigamist.
bigamy, obviously he's got to be a very good liar.
So he's not going to be a very good witness, is he?
No.
That must have been a shock to them because...
Definitely.
They would have to stay in prison till the second trial.
In case they absconded.
Yeah. It was a surprise that they got an extra witness, Joseph Orgill.
I think I'm more adamant now that George is definitely innocent.
On the 16th of March 1840 at Staffordshire Hall, the boatman's second trial began for the murder of Christina Collins. Her cause of death was central to the case. To examine the medical evidence further, Sasha and Jeremy are meeting forensic pathologist, Professor Peter Vanezes. He studied the report of the surgeon who testified 180 years ago, Mr. Samuel Barnard.
Jeremy.
In relation to the question of serious sexual assault, Mr. Barnett makes reference initially to there having been no illicit connection. How do you read his observations in relation to the possibility of serious sexual assault?
Well, first of all, that's a very difficult statement to be sure about in the first place. I presume that he's going on the appearance of the genitalia, the genital organs.
Is that because absence of any injury in that area doesn't necessarily exclude serious sexual assault?
That's correct, yes. I think he should have said, I don't know, I'm not sure.
Mr. Barnett concludes death was occasioned by suffocation from drowning.
I wouldn't use the word suffocation because that has other implications. Indicates that perhaps the person may have been in some other way incapacitated before they went into the water.
Right.
There's no evidence that there's been a struggle in terms of any bruising on her body or restraint. Now, what he's seeing in terms of the engorged lungs and most likely the water in the stomach as well is that the person died of wet drowning, the classical type of drowning. So she was alive when she entered the water. If she was unconscious, I would have expected her reflexes to have been diminished.
Yeah.
Therefore, unlikely to swallow that amount of water in the stomach.
Right.
So my guess is that she was probably alive and conscious. Carrying out a case like hers today, I would just simply call it drowning.
Orgill's evidence gives an account of Thomas and Ellis mauling Christina to death. The pathological evidence that we've seen in this case makes it quite plain that Christina would have been conscious because she swallowed a large amount of water. The one area where we can test Orgill's evidence demonstrates that it is unreliable.
Despite Orgill testifying at trial, none of the accounts from Owen, Ellis, or George Thomas were heard. As the case concluded, Judge Barangurney delivered his verdict. All three men were guilty. Jeanette and Patricia have come to the very courthouse in Stafford to read reports on the sentencing of the boatmen, including their relative, George Thomas.
Here I have the sentence of the death passed upon the prisoners. You have been found guilty of the foul crime of murder. Murder committed on an unoffending and helpless woman who was under your protection and who, there is reason to believe, was first the object of your lust and then, to prevent detection for the crime, was the object of your cruelty. Look not for pardon in this world. Apply to the God of mercy for the pardon which he alone can extend to penitent sinners, and prepare yourselves for the ignominious death which awaits you. The case is one of the most painful, the most disgusting, and the most shocking that ever came under my knowledge, and it remains for me only to pass upon you the awful sentence of the law. That you be taken to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and that you and each of you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your bodies afterwards be buried within the precincts of the prison. And may God have mercy on your souls.
It is hard how we've looked at all the evidence now and then we read this. It's sort of brought it home, and it is difficult to read.
On the 11th of April 1840, Owen, Ellis and George Thomas were read their last rites by the chaplain at Stafford Prison. Outside, a crowd of 10,000 people were waiting by the public gallows for the unusual spectacle of a triple execution. As the men were being led to the hangman, an incredible intervention was staged. "28-year-old William Ellis was granted a last-minute reprieve and spared the noose. But if clemency was sufficient for Ellis, why not for George Thomas? With Judgment Day looming, the barristers want to scrutinise this peculiar reprieve.
After the trial, it seemed that the view of the lawyers was that Ellis had played a considerably subordinate role to that of Owen and Thomas. In fact, he initially was returned to Stafford Prison, where reports are that he became a changed character. Ellis's sentence was commuted from the death penalty, and he was ordered to be transported to Australia for 14 years. And this was an era when prisoners were transported to Australia, where they would have to perform hard labour. And it was very dramatic, because in fact Ellis, Thomas and Owen had all received the last sacrament from the prison chaplain. And after receiving that, expecting immediate death, Ellis was reprieved in the presence of the other two. And on hearing the news that he was not going to lose his life, he immediately burst into tears and was very affectionate with his co-defendants, as indeed they were to him, saying to them, "God bless you, dear boys."
If indeed Ellis was transported to Australia for 14 years, that could well have been an onerous experience. It does not compare to being hanged by the neck and your life being brought to an end. Enabling Ellis to secure a vastly different sentence to that which Thomas was subjected to just further compounds my concerns about the injustice to George Thomas in this case.
George Thomas was hanged alongside Captain Owen outside the gates of Stafford Jail. Their bodies were buried within the prison grounds. Officer Stephen Edwards has brought Jeanette and Patricia to the location it's believed George Thomas rests.
There are actually two men in this grave we've seen here before us and one woman. It's maintained and cared for by men who are obviously locked up in Stafford Jail.
Would the prisoners of today mind if we lay these flowers for George?
Of course not.
And just before he was hung, he said that I didn't do this. I had nothing to do with it.
Terrible, terrible for him. You just can't imagine it.
Sasha and Jeremy have completed their investigation. They must put their submissions to Judge David Radford.
George Thomas's case is a shining example of why it's so important for us to revisit historic death penalty cases, because it shows how easy it was for someone to be hanged when there wasn't an iota of evidence against them.
Jeanette is hoping today her relative George Thomas can be exonerated for the murder of Christina Collins over 180 years ago.
Hopefully myself and the family will get the verdict that we would like, which is unsafe verdict.
Hi, Jeanette.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
And you.
Hello, good to see you.
How are you feeling today?
Apprehensive.
What do you think the most worrying part of the case is?
I think if we find a safe verdict, that's going to be a little bit distressing after finding so much information out.
There's no guarantees,
No.
but the case has been looked at very thoroughly.
Yes.
All right?
Yes,
OK?
thank you.
So if you'd like to follow us, we'll head off to the judge's room.
OK, thank you.
Sasha and Jeremy are ready to put their submissions before Judge Radford.
Please take a seat.
As a senior judge to the largest Crown Court in England and Wales, he's adjudicated over a wide range of high-profile cases.
I'm here today to inquire into the safety of the conviction of George Thomas, who was convicted together with co-accused of the murder of Mrs. Christina Collins. Mr. Dean.
Christina Collins joined a Pickford's flyboat, which was staffed by a captain and 3 men. Her body was found at 5 a.m. on Monday, the 17th of June. Witnesses painted a picture of her being victim of a drunken escapade, the suggestion that she was sexually abused and intimidated. It's my submission that George Thomas's conviction for murder is manifestly unsafe. That there is and was no eyewitness as to the circumstances in which she came to enter the water and die. What clearly happened here is that 3 of the crew, Ellis, Owen and Thomas, were lumped together by the criminal justice process. George Thomas found himself convicted of murder, albeit that there was no link between him and Christina Collins' killing. Professor Peter Venetsis, a forensic pathologist, said that he could only limit his finding to one of drowning, not suffocation, that it appeared to be wet drowning because there was water in her lungs. So, quote, she was alive when she entered the water. There was a lot of water in her stomach, which indicates she may have been conscious when she entered. No evidence of sexual assault. And the pathological evidence simply does not throw light on whether this might have been suicide, accidental death, or deliberate killing. There was a further serious complicating factor in the trial. A man was brought forward by the prosecution at very short notice. This man, Joseph Orgill, was placed in the box. He'd been convicted but had received a pardon for the bigamy he'd been sentenced to 18 months for. Orgill went on to say that Owen had told him that the killing of Christina Collins, and indeed her sexual assault, were perpetrated by George Thomas and Ellis, and that he, Owen, had said that it had nothing to do with him whatsoever. Furthermore, whilst Orgill maintained that he did not know that he'd been pardoned before he gave evidence, information has come to light in the course of this inquiry that Orgill had in fact been told that he would be pardoned before he gave evidence. Ultimately, without his evidence, there was no evidence of murder, and yet George Thomas, a young man, was hanged and lost his life. It's my submission, in all the circumstances, that his conviction is unsafe, and I invite Your Honour to declare in those terms.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Ms. Watts, what is your response?
Your Honour, the legal system operating in 1839 is unrecognisable as the legal system that is in existence today. The evidence of Captain Owen's cellmate, Joseph Orgill, amounted to the backbone of the prosecution case. This was not a situation where a cellmate was giving evidence about what a defendant was saying. This was a case where Orgill said that Owen was absolving himself, but implicating his co-defendants. So, in effect, this was self-serving evidence. It was the most tenuous type of hearsay one could imagine. Without Orgill, there is no evidence that Christina Collins' death was as a result of homicide at all. And there is nothing reliable in the evidence of Orgill which could possibly suggest that this verdict was safe. So I entirely agree with the submissions made by Mr. Dean.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Watts. Well, I shall consider these matters for myself, if you allow me some time to do that.
Thank you.
The legal arguments have now been presented, but have Sasha and Jeremy done enough to question the original conviction?
So, Jeanette, how do you think that went?
A lot better than what I expected.
Just because Jeremy and I agree does not mean that the judge will do what we want him to.
No.
He will only certify this as unsafe if that is his view.
Did George Thomas brutally murder Christina Collins 180 years ago? Or was he a scapegoat who was wrongly executed at the age of just 27? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
At the first trial of the boatman, the judge directed the jury to acquit those in the dock of the allegations of serious sexual assault. The trial on the other charges, including murder, should then have been continued. The prosecution called as a witness a convicted prisoner called Orgill, who claimed that Thomas's co-accused Owen, the boat captain, had told him, Orgill, in prison, that whilst he, Owen, had not committed murder, the other two still in the dock, Thomas and Ellis, had. This evidence constituted inadmissible hearsay. It was, anyway, evidence given by a man of little credibility in exchange for a free pardon. The reality is there were no eyewitnesses to assist any jury as to how or why Mrs. Collins came to be in the canal or how and why she drowned. There was no physical evidence of sexual or any other kind of assault found in relation to Mrs. Collins anyway. I am in absolutely no doubt that demonstrably and unarguably this was a completely unsafe conviction of murder. I shall rise.
Sorry, it's quite emotional going through this amazing journey, and then with the help of both of you, I'm overwhelmed and I'm just so pleased. So sorry.
Don't worry.
So, Jeanette, that was a really strong decision by Judge Radford. He wasn't just saying there was a technicality. He effectively said this case should never have been brought, which is very rare for a judge to say something like that. So you should take real comfort from that.
Yeah.
I think the important thing about George Thomas's case is that it will bring home just how unacceptable the death penalty was in this country, because from your reaction and everything we've come to know about you, you've seen this as an incredibly emotional experience. And maybe when you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll find it difficult to believe that you succeeded in your quest.
Yes, and really appreciate it, and thank you.
Fantastic.
It has been an absolute pleasure to meet you, and we wish
Thank
you
you.
the very best.
It's been a real pleasure, and
Thank
we're
you.
very happy for you.
Thank you very
and
much.
George Thomas, of course.
Thank you. I'm really happy. I'm ecstatic. I am really over the moon. Can't wait to phone Pat and tell Pat. If George Thomas was here now, hopefully he'd be giving me a hug and thanking me for the hard work that myself and other family members have done to clear his name.